Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Tonight's event is the next installment in the Markell family Jewish Literary and Cultural Arts series. And tonight's event is in partnership with the Jewish Historical Society of Memphis and the Mid-South. Tonight, we will be talking with Pam Jenoff about her newest book, The Woman with the Blue Star. And you can get this book for purchase locally at Novel. Of course, it's available at Barnes & Noble and Amazon and lots of different places online, but locally, Novel is our partnership bookstore for our entire series. So they have a whole table set out for us. So it's easy to find. So head up to Novel, grab the book. If you haven't gotten it yet, it's wonderful. Although I know many of you have because this was our community read. Pam is the author of several books of historical fiction, including the bestsellers The Orphan's Tale and The Lost Girls of Paris. Her novels are inspired by her experiences working at the Pentagon and as a diplomat for the State Department, handling Holocaust issues in Poland. Interviewing with me tonight is Dorothy Goldwyn. Dorothy is the daughter of two Holocaust survivors and serves on the Holocaust Memorial Committee of Jewish Community Partners in Memphis. She is also active with Facing History and Ourselves and is on their Speakers Bureau. I want to thank the Jewish Book Council, Jewish Community Partners, Jewish Historical Society of Memphis and the Mid-South, Novel, of course. All of these different organizations come together to allow these events to happen. So thank you, thank you. I'm so glad all of you are here. And we're going to start talking with Pam. So Pam, can you please just start by giving us some background on how you decided to write this particular story?
I will. First, I want to say thank you. So thank you to Marcy for all of your hard work in pulling this together. And thank you to Dorothy for agreeing to be here and speak with me, and to Novel, and to everyone who's taking time out at this busy time of year to chat this evening. I've been with Jewish Book Council for many years. I always say I'm their Borscht Belt performer because I go around and around for them every year, but I have not yet been to Memphis. So it's going on my list for when we can. So if I can just take a slight detour, since I've never spoken to my friends in Memphis before, and just say a word or two about the background that led me to writing the books in general, would that be okay? Please?
Absolutely.
Okay, so my story began about 25 years ago. I was sent to Krakow, Poland as a diplomat for the US State Department. And I was sent there at this very critical moment in time when Poland had just come out of communism and it was becoming a democracy, and it had many issues from World War II that needed to be resolved that they'd never been able to work out. I didn't go to Poland to work on those issues. I actually just went there to stamp visas and passports and help Americans over there when they got in trouble. But I went to Poland alone. I was a young woman in my early 20s, and now you all know how old I am. And when I went to Poland, it was before cell phones and it was before the internet. So I was alone halfway around the world. And being Jewish, I gravitated toward the surviving Jewish community in Krakow. And I'm happy to talk about them during the Q&A. But they really took me in. I was at their shul every Friday night, and they became like grandparents to me, and they trusted me with their stories. And so the US consulate saw that I had a relationship with them, and they put me in charge of all those Holocaust issues that were still like remaining. And so that's what I did for all of those years in Poland. Whenever something was going on related to the war, I would kind of try and work it out. And I won't go into too much detail because I know we have a lot to talk about, but it was both very challenging and also very rewarding on personal and professional levels. And so I came back from those years in Poland very changed, and I've sort of been writing about them ever since. So all of my books come from that kind of love I have for the people and the experiences. Now, The Woman with the Blue Star is my 11th book, and this comes not from one of my experiences over there. I write fiction, so they don't tend to be real people's stories, but it came from an idea that I found while researching. And you might be curious how authors come up with their ideas. And I will tell you, I go looking for them. So what I'm looking for in a book idea is the gasp. I'm looking for the moment, because if I can find something that will make me gasp after 25 years of working with the war, I'm hopeful that you will feel the same way. And in the case of the woman with the blue star, it was the discovery that there was a group of Jewish people in Lvov, Poland, who had survived the war by hiding in a sewer. And I don't mean they hid like they ran through that sewer on their way out of town. These people lived in the sewer for more than a year. And when I heard this, I had so many questions. I wanted to know, who were these people and what were their lives like and how had they survived and who had helped them? And in particular, I was taken by an anecdote of a young girl in the sewer who one day looked up and she saw a girl her own age through the grate buying flowers. And she was very struck by the disparity between her life and the girl on the street. Her mother said to her, "Someday there will be flowers for you." It was this kind of promise. And so when I heard this story, I found myself imagining what would have happened if the girl in the sewer and the girl on the street had the chance to get to know one another and what that would have meant for both of their lives.
That's great. And that leads actually into the question that I had. And as Marcy said, being a child of Holocaust survivors, and I will add they're both from Poland. My father was liberated from Dachau and my mother was in the Częstochowy labor camps. So the whole setting of this underground sewer sort of boggled my mind, just picturing that underground sewer. It was very intense, and it must have been challenging as far as writing about it and getting all the details. And I think you just explained to me about the research, but just in how you approached it in the storyline. But the intensity and the gravity of getting that information must have been hard too.
It was. So, I write books set in Europe, and I did live in Europe for about 5 years, but I don't always get to go back for things. So when you don't get to go back, there are some wonderful sources you can use. So whether it's memoir, photographs, periodicals, correspondence, all of those things are really helpful. And if you're lucky, there's one nonfiction book, or there's a few that give you what you need. And in this case, there's a wonderful nonfiction book called In the Sewers of Lvov by Robert Marshall. And it detailed really graphically what their conditions were like and how big the pipes were and all of that. So I was very lucky. Now, Dorothy, my answers are a little long, but I have to share. For this book, when I moved the story from Lvov to Krakow, which was sort of a personal and artistic decision, I decided I was going to go to Krakow because I had not been back in 17 years. The people I know there who are still alive are not getting any younger. And I booked myself a really nice trip to Krakow, like a mom's only trip. And it was scheduled to begin on March 11th, 2020. And so we all pull out our mental calendars and we say, because as COVID started bubbling up, my publisher said, "We don't know if you should go on that trip." And I said, "I am going, and I'm going to wear one of those masks." Masks were. And the flights all got canceled on March 11th. And thank goodness they did, because I had an emergency appendectomy on March 12th. So I would have been in the air headed to Poland. But I never got to go. And so the really wonderful thing was that all of the contacts I still have in the US consulate in Krakow had set up these meetings for me when I was supposed to go. And when COVID hit, they all pivoted and they made those virtual meetings for me. So I had a sewer expert and a city expert and all of that.
That appears quite challenging to write about, being in the sewer. Yes.
Yes.
And you talked to us, sort of at the start of this about how you got the idea for Ella and Sadie's relationship. And I'm just wondering, what about that idea made you want them to connect so deeply? And what do you think it was in your story that made them connect so deeply?
Well, if you look at Sadie and Ella, so Sadie's a young woman and she's living in the sewer with her parents, although she becomes increasingly isolated and she's very much looking for that kind of emotional connection. And Ella, at first glance, doesn't look like she's struggling in the war. She's not Jewish. She's not persecuted. She's from an affluent family. But when we look closer at Ella, we see that she too is quite isolated. She's lost all of her family except for a really awful stepmother who's consorting with the Germans and a fiance who never told her he was back from the war. And so she too is quite isolated when they meet, and it's this connection. And I found it very interesting to be writing a book about isolation and connection right as COVID happened, because while I would certainly never suggest that our lives are anything like what went on in my book, you know, we were all isolated in our homes and we were trying to connect. We were learning how to use Zoom, and we were doing car parades and waving at people from across the street and all of that. And so it really resonated with me that we were trying to connect just like Sadie and Ella were.
You know, that really resonates with me, because I think for a brief moment at the very beginning of COVID, you know, there has been and there had been so much, you know, arguing and fighting, you know, between political parties and differences. And there was just you know, the air was just thick with that. And when we were all isolated, of course, it looked different, you know, depending on where you were in your life and how much money you had and what neighborhood you lived in. But there was a sort of camaraderie that came of that. And when you talk about Ella and Sadie's relationship and their shared experience of isolation, that is something that I experienced as well. Yeah, I'm gonna hand it off to Dorothy.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's relevant. I think we all can relate to that. Everybody that read the book or that's listening to this now can totally relate to what Pam just said to us about that isolation. I realize, Pam, this is a historical fiction, but yet I felt like, and I don't know if it's just from my past and what I've told you, that I was like living the story with the characters as the story progressed. I felt their isolation. I felt their fear. I felt the connection of them struggling to survive, and it just hit very close to home. And I'm curious if this was your intention that you wanted for all readers, or was it just something that I was feeling?
You know, in every book, you want to put your reader in the shoes of your protagonist. So you obviously want to do what we call world building, right? You want to build a
Right.
world that's plausible and real and all. It's hard. I mean, I don't just say, you know, it's a question of, do I want to spend a year with the sewer? It's like when I wrote The Orphan's Tale, I was like, I'm not sure I
Yeah.
want to spend a year with the circus. You know, you have to think about that world you're going to have to inhabit. So it's really hard, but not do I just want people to experience the physical world. You want a reader to step into the shoes of your character and say, what would I have done? Because the truth is, history is not made up of black and white. It was made up of thousands and thousands of individual decisions, you know, that people made, and personal choice and responsibility. And so it's not just that you're inhabiting their physical world, but you're inhabiting their dilemmas, I think.
Well, I think, and as you talked about the sewer, and you said, "Is what would I have done?" I mean, I thought, you know, stories, all of them, of running to the forest or running to get away somewhere else. I never, all these years, thought about being in a sewer, and maybe I've got a little claustrophobia. I don't know, but just even when I tried to relate to them in the sewer, it was like I felt myself even breathing heavy. You know, just getting very emotional and intense. Like I could never do this. I couldn't live in the sewer. What would I do? And just kept having those feelings.
But I do want to say, and this also relates to our experience last year with COVID, is that people say, well, how did they live in the sewer for a year? You have to remember, when they went in that sewer, they didn't think they were going for a year. They thought they were going for a couple hours or a couple days. And it's amazing what you can handle in smaller increments, because does anyone remember 2 weeks to flatten the curve? Like, we didn't think we were going to be home for 8 months, you know?
Yeah, maybe a month. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. And it's survival, I guess. That's what I just kept thinking about. I think when the war started, even just before, you know, they didn't think it was going to last for that many years. They probably thought this is going to be over as soon as they free us.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point.
So you mentioned also about this being based on a true story. You know, in your research, you found that there were people, I think, living in a different part of Poland than where your story takes place, and that, you know, your books are based on true events. Can you share a little bit more about the true story that your book is based on?
Certainly. So I never say based on, I say inspired by, and that's only because I don't write about real people. I just borrow elements of the story. And I feel like sometimes historical fiction writers, we can get in trouble if we stake too large a claim around what is real in our book. So what is real is that the actual story took place in Lvov, Poland, and it was multiple families that fled to the sewer when the place they lived was liquidated by the Germans. And so they went into the sewer very much in a physical surrounding like I described, because the sewer in Lviv at some points is as wide as a raging river, where you people could and did drown in that sewer. And so the danger, and some pipes are so little, they're called 40s, and they're 40 inches, and you would have to shimmy through them. And the kinds of dangers that I chronicle in the book are real, whether it's drowning in the river, whether it was the rising water, starvation, disease, detection. They faced all of that. And some people, it was too much for them, and they tried to flee, and they were killed fleeing. So I don't have an exact number of people that went into the sewer in front of me, and I don't, because there were different people at different points. I think when they got out of the sewer, which was at the liberation of Lviv, it was about 12 to 14-ish. I don't want to get that wrong. There was a man, in my book, he's called Pavel, but in real life, his name was Leopold, and he was a very great hero. And he really helped the Jews in the sewer. So he wasn't noble before the war. He had been a thief, and he became a sewer worker. And at some point he connected with the Jews, and he agreed to provide them with food in exchange for money. And they were paying him for food. And then they ran out of money, and they really didn't know what would happen. Would he still come? And not only did he still keep coming, I mean, he'd have to go all over the city to get enough food without attracting attention. He brought them candles, he brought them prayer books, and he stayed with them in Lviv right until liberation. And literally, as he brought them out of the ground, he said, "These are my Jews." He was very proud. And so the real life hero, and he's in Yad Vashem, you could look him up. He was actually killed a couple years after the war because he was biking with his young daughter, and a truck came barreling toward them, and he pushed his daughter out of the way to save her, and he was killed. So he was a hero right until the end. Other things that were true in the sewer: someone really did give birth to a baby down there. Someone really did drown. So those are kind of the core things from Sadie's story that are true. Ella is a work of fiction. So.
Interesting.
That's really
mentioned-
interesting.
Yeah.
And Dorothy, I was going to say, such an example of an upstander.
Yeah.
I think,
Ella. Yeah.
Dorothy, you can go ahead, Dorothy.
Yeah, I agree. I will. Yeah, I don't want to let that go, because that's what we talk about in today's world too, is Ella, who could have and almost lost everything. It was very risky what she did, and there were many upstanders like her. Unfortunately, we hear about all the deaths and everything, but to hear the story about how terrible it was in the sewer, but then to have Ella, the relationship of Sadie and Ella, gives you that hope and that feeling of the love and the caring that we tend to forget about as we talk about all the hate. So I really like that part of it too.
I just want to real quick remind everybody, if you have any questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we're going to get to them in a few minutes. But send your questions in, and we are going to get to those questions that are coming in through the chat and the Q&A.
Oh, Marcy, speaking of the real story, can I share my slides? Would that work?
Yes.
This
will not take long, but I have a very few slides that relate to the real life research that I did for this book. So let me see if I can manage a share screen here. Let's see if this works. Okay, so I'm just going, let's see if I can present. Can you, come on, slides, where'd they go? They were here. Okay, can you see my slides there? Okay, this is a depiction of what it was like inside the sewer of Lviv. So you can see it's a great rushing body of water, and there's just a very narrow path on the side. There's no railing or guardrail or anything to hold on to so people could fall in. But this is what the larger pipe inside the sewer would have looked like. This is a sewer grate in the city, like the one that Sadie and Ella would have looked through. They actually, in my book, meet at two places, one that's a sewer grate and one that's more on a riverbank. This would be the sewer grate. So you have some idea of what it would look like for them to see one another. This is a fountain in Lviv, and one thing that was detailed in the book was that, these people were right under the ground. Like, they could hear people on the street, they could hear the choir singing in the church, and so those people could hear them if they weren't careful. But they got water in a number of different ways, whether that was the fountain or the melting snow. So you can just see what it would have looked like above ground. This was one of the fountains. This is Leopold, the real life hero, who I just told you his story in great detail. Now, I wanted to show this map. This is Krakow. So when I moved my story to Krakow, I had to make sure that everything I knew about Lviv was going to be plausible in Krakow. And I had a sewer expert and that sort of thing. And the problem with Krakow that nearly derailed me is there's a large river that bisects Krakow. If you've ever been there, it's the Wisła River. And so above the river, you have the old city and you have the historic, beautiful Jewish quarter. And below the river, you have Schindler's factory, the ghetto, and where the sewer would have been. And I could never learn in my research whether in the 1940s you could have gone underneath that river by sewer, whether the pipe would have connected the two sides to the two riverbanks. And so in my book, every time someone has to cross the river to go into the city, they had to come above ground because I couldn't take that leap and suggest that they were able to cross underneath.
That's a really interesting detail. Like it's sort of like a behind the scenes,
Oh, we sweat all of that. I remember debates with my publisher about whether a bus in 1946 London costed 2 pence or 5 pence and whether it had doors. Like, we really work on the details. And then my very last slide, this is modern day, but this is the view in Krakow. If you were standing over by the sewer and the ghetto, looking into the old city, this is Wawel Castle. And so the green riverbank you see here is the kind of place, there was a secluded spot where, with another grate where the women could have met as well, just as a visual. So those are all my slides, and I'd love to take more questions if you have them.
But before I ask my next question, are there any markers in Lviv, Poland, where they were in the sewer, like to show these are where?
So I did not get to go to Lviv because of everything that happened, but I will tell you that in the past few months, I read an article, I could probably look it up for you, that they just excavated the sewer, archaeologists. So I don't think it was possible to go in there before, but they just found the site. So.
Okay. And we hit on my next question, which was about COVID. Did you write, since you did do most of your writing during COVID, do you feel you wrote differently or added different parts or got more specific in certain areas as a result of COVID?
Well, I'm going to answer a lot, I think maybe more than broader than your question, but I promise to answer it. So what happened was I was writing this book in 2019 and I turned it into my editor around November, December of 19. And after 11 books, my beloved editor, she went, no. And I was like, no. And she was like, no. And I had written a real clunker of a first draft on this book. And so I had to rewrite this entire book in 5 months. And that was kind of right as COVID was happening. So, I started it before COVID and I finished it during COVID. So it was sort of an interesting transition. And in addition to the parallels we talked about before, I should also note that, one of the things I really identified with was Sadie's mother, because at one point she was living a modern life in the city and suddenly she's trying to protect her family underground. And I don't know about you, but I certainly never thought that in 2020, I would be asking questions like, can I get meat and can I get toilet paper and how am I going to educate my children? So it highlighted for me the way that life can change in an instant in a way that I probably have never felt in writing my other books. Now, I want to take a little liberty and add on to that because there was kind of a bigger life lesson as a writer through COVID for me. When COVID hit and the kids came home, and by the way, when I had that emergency appendectomy, I came home from the hospital the next day and the schools had closed and we never left the house again. So it was this Rip Van Winkle moment because it had all changed that one night I was in the hospital. So the kids were home. We got a pandemic puppy because we knew we were going to be home for a really long time. And for 6 months, I never got to write a word. Like that whole summer where no one could go out of the house, I never wrote a word. And I felt terrible. It felt like not exercising. I felt like icky and gross. So the fall came in 2020. The kids went online for school. I put the dog in daycare, which, by the way, is a very big thing with authors, doggy daycare. I've had this conversation many times. And I started to work again. And it was like the best thing ever, physically, mentally. And it really taught me that I think, especially for women, we make excuses for our work. We apologize. We treat it like our free time, like we feel guilty. And it felt so good and it was good for me and my family. And I just made a sort of thought, well, I'm not going to apologize for working anymore. So.
Good point.
Yeah.
Very good.
You mentioned also that your editor had some changes. You said that you wrote your words, not mine, of course, that you wrote a clunker of a first draft.
I did.
What were some of the maybe later changes that your editor wanted to make to the story that, did they fundamentally change it? Was there anything big?
So I have to tell you about this conversation and how this works. Revision's always bad anyway, but I knew I had to have this call with my editor, and I was driving back from like a legal education course, and I was in the car and I needed to be able to write. So I pulled over off the highway into a Bob Evans. I think it's the only time I've ever been in a Bob Evans in my life. I get a coffee and I sit down, and she starts telling me, usually in publishing, they give you more problems than solutions. Like they tell you what's broken and you fix it. But my editor's really, really a genius. But like when they tell you something that they want to fix or change or what's wrong, it's so awful and it's so enormous and so impossible that you're like, no. And then 2 minutes later, you're like, yep, they're right. This is always how it happens. Okay. So, and I'm going to get to the specific changes in a moment. So, the two specific things that she wanted changed, and she was right, is one, I had actually set much of the book after liberation, and she said, no, we really need to see more in the sewer of the development of the relationship. Also, I had written the first draft just from Sadie's point of view. And it was my editor who said, you need to go back and write it from Ella's point of view, which was hard. But of course, she was completely right. And so I want to tell you that when I get awful news like revision, I like wring my hands for 5 minutes. And then I always think of a quote from The Godfather Part 2. I think it was Hyman Roth. And he said, this is the business we have chosen. Mm-hmm. And so for me, as a writer, the revision is the business we have chosen.
Interesting.
I love that. I'm going to write that down and I'm going to use that. I love that.
That's like my toughen up quote.
So speaking of the business you have chosen, I'm interested. I'm sure everyone else is too. Like, what are you working on next or now?
You. Authors love that question. I am working on a book inspired by a true story of the only known sabotage of a train headed for Auschwitz. So there was a train that was going from Belgium to the camps, and there was an attempt to sabotage it. And my book looks fictitiously in part at both the saboteurs and the people on the train.
Interesting.
Yeah, it'll be out early 2023 if I get it done, which sounds really far away to most of you, and it sounds terrifyingly soon to me. So
that was going to be my next question, was when do we get to read it?
I'm working super hard. I've always been a member of the 5 a.m. Writers Club, but I have to tell you, I love 5 a.m. I hate 4 a.m. And sometimes when you got to get it done, like now it becomes 4 a.m.
4 a.m.
I could show you. My phone is right here. My alarm is set for 4.
That's a lot of research too. To a lot that book will a lot of detail. Yeah.
If there was, and I'm going to get to the questions in the chat in just a moment. If there was a takeaway message for your book, whether it relates to Ella and Sadie's relationship or otherwise, what are you hoping that readers take away from this?
And this kind of goes across all of my books, that one of the things I find most interesting about writing the war is that you have these characters, often women, who through normal circumstances would have had their feet on a very certain path. But because of war or other catastrophe, they're thrown off that path. They're challenged. They're tested in ways they never had imagined. And part of what I like is seeing how they respond. But part of what I like is that they meet people who through normal circumstances they never would have met. Sadie and Ella never would have met each other but for the war. And so I hope for readers, when they look at people in my books who are from very different backgrounds and they see those people transcend their differences, that the readers will empathize and that it will help us reduce some of the otherness and division that we all feel right now. So, yes.
Very nice.
Really important. We have an anonymous question coming in. I'm curious as to how you chose the age and gender of your protagonists.
Well, I do tend to write more about women. And maybe it's conscious, although I have done some books, like one of my books, The Things We Cherished, focused on sets of brothers. So it's not exclusively about women. But the little girl in the sewer was female who looked up and saw another girl. It's hard to write an adult book from the point of view of a very young child. It works sometimes, but it's not often ideal. So moving her to adulthood was a logical step. Now, it's interesting in my books, I think my women tend to be disproportionately young, and I'm not sure why that is. I mean, I would like to take a shot at writing someone. I mean, I'm 50, so I would like to take a shot at that, and I'm not sure why my characters have sort of tapped out at like 30, except that people did things much younger. They took on these really enormous roles. So
Dorothy, do you have any more questions before I keep pulling from the chat? You're still muted.
I'd like to hear some questions from the chat.
Okay, got it. Okay. Let's see. Susan Stein is asking, how do you pronounce Ella's brother's name?
Remind me of the name, because I don't have it in front of me.
Masij?
Mache.
Mache, thank you.
Mache, yes.
I got it wrong.
Mache. It's like
Mache.
a state, yeah.
Okay, and then Lenny. Lenny is a wonderful storyteller. She's involved in so many areas of Jewish Memphis, but she's involved particularly with the Jewish Historical Society. And she is asking, did you use the name Ella because of Cinderella and the Wicked Stepmother?
Ooh.
Wondering, this reminds me of Lenny, wondering about how you chose the names of your characters.
Well, I will tell you, I did not think of that. So that is very good and probably subconscious. No, let me tell you a little bit about choosing character names and why it's sort of tough. All right. So let's imagine in several of my books, we have 2 main females or 3 main females. You want them to have very distinct names so you don't confuse the women. However, if you look at Europe and particularly Eastern Europe, almost all of the female names end with an A. So you've got your Ellas and Allas and Annas and Emma, you see, and so it's actually very hard to find distinct sounding names that are authentic to a particular country because they tend to be phonetically similar. So that's very difficult. Then you want to make sure it's a name that you haven't used in your earlier books because there's a lot of names and a lot of people out there. And you want it to fit the person. And in order to figure out if it's an appropriate name for the year you're writing in, there's these birth indexes of like most popular names in 1922 France, babies born. And you would look at those to kind of make sure you're in the right zone on a name. So.
Oh, I'm muted. There we go. Let's see. I have got, oh, look. Barbara Hellman just threw in the chat, and keep the questions coming. We'll do this for a couple more minutes.
They're scared off by my long answers.
No, it's great. I would love, we want to hear more from you, not from me.
No, it's great.
Loved this book and want to read more of your books. Tell us more about the end. Spoiler alert if you haven't read it, but I know most people have since this was our community read. Tell us more about the end when we don't know who survives. When did you decide to do this?
So I'm going to keep it vague for the people who have not read it. What a couple communities did, which was really cool. I don't know if it's viable. At the end of the chat, they had anyone who did not want to hear the spoilers log off. And they had the people that wanted to hear about the end stay on for like an extra 2 minutes. But I will stay vague right now. And I will tell you that. So let me back up. There's 2 kinds of writers. Have you ever heard this? There's plotters, and they're the dear souls that write everything chronologically and they organize and they make it look nice. And that's not me. I'm a pantser. And a pantser means you write by the seat of your pants. And so when I have an idea, I go, and all these words like fly out in a random order. It's terrible. So the reason I tell you this is there's never really a beginning of the process or an end of the process for me. It's all kind of at the same time. But I always have an opening image in my mind, and I generally know where I'm going to wind up. And then in between, in the dark, there's 1 or 2 lighthouses, these kind of scenes that are high moments that I can see that get me across the book. So I think I always knew how it was going to end, but I didn't know who. And so that can flip back and forth. I can debate that with my editor, and there's this one point, I don't know if anyone here listened to the book on audio. I'm not an audiobook person, but I do get to preview the narrators and give some input. And this book had great narrators, but there's a chapter pretty close to the end of the book where you don't know who is speaking, right? You don't know who's alive. You don't know who's made it. And that's hard to do on audio because you either had to use the Sadie narrator or the Ella narrator. And if I used one of them, it was going to give away the truth of the ending too soon. And if I used the other one, it would be misleading and a lie. So it was very hard to keep that hidden in audio. But I will tell you that I knew what was going to happen, but I didn't know which one till later.
I want to throw in
How's
another
that for
question.
me?
Yeah, no, that's great. Go ahead, Dorothy.
This is a little question is not quite following this, but as we're talking, what's going through my head is like, yes, this is historical fiction, but it's still for people that don't want to read just the real history, gives them information, gives them knowledge about what went on during the Holocaust. With today's world of the denial of the Holocaust and all the anti-Semitism, I'm just curious, like who is reading your books? I don't know if you know this, but is it predominantly the Jewish world, or do we have, is it broader than that? Because my whole thing that I want to do and my life's mission is to educate people. So I'm thinking about, my brain is working in that direction.
Well, I do think I obviously I love my Jewish readers are close to my heart. It's a much wider cross section. I think World War II fiction is so universally popular, and it couldn't be the case if it was like just us reading it. You know what I mean? So
Yes.
I think it is, and the books are published in many, 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 many languages. I don't always know the languages until copies show up on my doorstep, and I'm like, I think this is Macedonian, like that's sort of how it works. So the books get published all over the place. So clearly there's an appetite for the material. The books tend to have, sometimes can have a more feminine cover, but I think readers are equally male. Sometimes the books dip down into the teens and the young adult market because they always want to read up a little bit. So I'm very happy with all the folks who are interested in these books.
But I feel like it's
they don't make
educating.
the bestseller list for no reason, right?
Right.
I will tell you though, lest you think that's something I would take for granted. From the day my first book published to the day I hit the New York Times was exactly 10 years to the day. So
That's amazing. That's meant to be. 10
years, 9 books just to make the list for the first time. I don't take it for granted.
That's lovely. Eileen Posner, hi Eileen, is asking, this is very interesting, what made you decide to match Sadie, a non-observant Jew, with Saul, a Hasidic Jew?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, there certainly were different Jews who had different levels of observance in the sewer. But when I went to Poland, and I didn't spend that much time on that part of my talk, you can imagine that I was like this girl from Cherry Hill who grew up Reformed and went to shul, went to synagogue a couple times a year. And I show up in Krakow, and there's one synagogue, and it's Orthodox, and the women sit at the back. And I was there every week, and it was such an education for me. But I learned a lot from the people, but they were really accepting. I remember one of them saying to me, like, have a good fast if you're fasting, So everybody was very, very open. And I was very affected by that experience. And so I wanted to incorporate some of that in the book. And the other thing I love about history, I don't want to show black and white. I want to show gray areas. And I hate broad pronouns in history. Like if you say they, I'm going to say who are you talking about? Like which they? And so when we talk about Jews in history, like I don't want one picture. I want people to see that it wasn't a monolith. There were Jewish people from different levels of observance and different educational backgrounds and different economic levels. And so bringing together Sadie and Saul and having them be from different backgrounds, but be able to find each other was an opportunity to do that.
We have a couple of people asking what genres you like to read in your own time. What's your favorite book that's not something that you've written? Who are some of your favorite authors, your favorite books, and your favorite genres?
I read everything. I should say, first of all, I'm a voracious library user. So I use 5 library systems, especially before COVID. During COVID, one of the libraries actually called to check on me. That's a true story. And I celebrated my 50th birthday in June by taking my kids back to our public library for the first time. So because I love buying books, but with the volume we read, it's really hard to keep up. I am like a feast or famine reader where you'll have like 5 things you're really into and then nothing for a while. I read everything. I read all the historical fiction that comes across. I have a lot of really good author friends in the historical fiction genre, but same in the suspense genre. So for a while I was on a suspense bender, and sometimes I get advanced copies of books. So there's a really good one next year called The Lying Club by Annie Ward. She's from Kansas and her book's coming out. I'm sure you've all heard of Lisa Scottolini's Eternal, was amazing. Her daughter, Francesca Saratella, wrote Ghosts of Harvard. That was really good. Oh, look at you've got it right there. And then I just read nonfiction. I was reading Made because I watched the miniseries and I've met Stephanie Land. And so that was really good. It's really hard to keep track. I do something, well, first, every Friday on my Facebook page, I ask people what they're reading to get suggestions. And then I do this thing called 100 Days of Books, where before I publish, every day for 100 days, I post another author's book that I really loved. And so that's a way of kind of paying it forward. So if anybody wants book suggestions, I actually have the 100 days, which I've done 3 times, on Pinterest boards with all 100 books there. So I'll be.
Do you post these on Instagram as well?
When I'm doing the actual posts, I do them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and then I leave a review for the book if it's already out on Goodreads and Amazon, and then I round up the 100 books on Pinterest to have it in one place.
That's amazing. So we have a lot of touch points for you.
Yes.
Let me just double check this chat right here. I think we've covered all of our questions, and I want to just say, you mentioned the book Eternal by Lisa Scottolini, and another #1 best-selling author. This is our next community read.
Yay. Is Lisa going to join you?
She's joining us on Zoom, just like you are now. And this is January 11th. And folks, you can go register for this event on the JCC website, LitFest live page, the next community read right here. Again, you can purchase it at Novel. Thank you to Novel for helping us out with this.
She's amazing. She's an amazing friend. She's here in Philadelphia, and we really don't get to see each other, but she sent me dog toys when I got my puppy. So she's a good friend.
I just got a puppy a couple months ago.
What'd you get?
I don't know if I can, well, he's not a puppy. I don't know if I can consider him a pandemic dog because we're sort of coming out of it. But
yeah.
Anyhow, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Dorothy, thank you, Pam. This was so lovely. Your book was fantastic. If you have not gotten a chance to read this yet, The Woman with the Blue Star, I cannot recommend this enough. Dorothy and I are in the same book club, and our book club read it. I mean,
We love
speaking
it.
of different, branches of Jews coming together and loving on each other, this book club has just been incredible. And we read this and we all loved it. And a few I know are on this call tonight. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Dorothy.
Appreciate it.
Stay in
Pam.
touch. I'll see you for the next book in person.
Absolutely. We can't wait.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.